So good evening, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's program with Marion Novack as part of our Stories Survive series. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit us in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, The Life and Work of Arthur Szyk, which opens December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that is the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Now today, we are honored to be joined by Marion Novack. Marion Novack was born in Denmark on an estate where her father worked as a farm laborer after the family had been liberated from Theresienstadt. They lived in a house that was a converted schoolhouse before emigrating to the United States in December 1947. Her early years were spent in Rhode Island before moving to Queens, New York. She was a recruiter specializing in healthcare professionals before joining Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She retired after a 10-year tenure, the last 5 years as manager of the blood donor program. Marion and her husband, Marshall, have been married for 61 years and have lived in Riverdale, New York for the past 32 years. They have 2 daughters, 2 granddaughters, and 2 granddogs. She is currently in the process of claiming German citizenship, thereby restoring her parents' birthright. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Marion. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you for joining me today. I am the daughter and younger sister of Holocaust survivors, and I'm going to share with you the impact of the Holocaust on my family and how I discovered information that led to a remarkable adventure I took in 2010 with my husband Marshall and our dear friends Renee and Marty. This faded 1943 photograph is of my mother standing on the doorstep of a small house. A unique series of events 67 years after the photograph was taken brought me to the doorstep of that house, the house my parents lived in when they were taken prisoner by the Gestapo in Assens, Denmark, during Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year holiday, in October 1943. The persecution of German Jews began slowly in Denmark. Persecution of German Jews began slowly in the 1930s. In 1935, Hitler's Nuremberg race laws decreed that Jews, including my parents, were no longer German citizens. Jews were no longer permitted to go to theaters, stadiums, or other public venues, and Jewish children were not allowed to attend school. My parents, Hans and Hilda, fled their native Berlin and the Nazis in December 1938, 1 month after Kristallnacht. For those of you who do not already know, Kristallnacht, often referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, was a series of attacks against Jews throughout Nazi Germany and also parts of Austria. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered, thousands of businesses were damaged, and hundreds of homes, schools, cemeteries, and synagogues were vandalized. Many were set on fire. Kristallnacht marked a major escalation in the Nazi program of Jewish persecution and ultimately extermination. My parents were members of Hechelutz, a Zionist socialist youth movement whose long-term goal was the creation of a Jewish state in what was then Palestine. Hechelitz partnered with the Danish Agricultural Travel Bureau, providing trainees, including my parents, to work on farms and acquire the farming skills necessary for them to emigrate to Palestine. At that time in 1938, the British controlled Palestine, and only people who could help develop the country were considered for immigration. My parents lived and worked on different farms for 5 years. The German occupation of Denmark began on April 9th, 1940. Hitler permitted the Danish government complete autonomy until 1943, when the Danish people rebelled against the German occupation by using labor strikes and sabotage. On August the 29th, 1943, the Nazi commander in Denmark declared martial law after the Danish government refused to punish the citizens that were involved in the resistance movement. Just 1 month later, on October 1st, the Gestapo roundup of Jews began. More than 6,000 Danish Jews, almost the entire Danish Jewish population, was smuggled to Sweden, mostly by Danish fishing boats, after they had been warned that deportation had started. But the farms in Assens, where my parents and other Hechelitz members worked, was too far away to take advantage of the Danish rescue operation, which was happening near the coast of Copenhagen. In addition, according to my dad, a man in Assens told the Gestapo which farms had Jewish workers. And so on October 2nd, 1943, when my mother was 7 months pregnant with my older sister, my parents, along with 28 other Hechelitz members who were living and working in Assens, plus 53 Danish Jews who were also captured, were all deported, first by bus and then by cattle car, to Theresienstadt, or as the Germans called it, Theresienstadt, a concentration camp in what was Czechoslovakia and is now known as the Czech Republic. Theresienstadt was primarily a Nazi transit camp 40 miles from Prague. More than 140,000 Jews, including 15,000 children, were imprisoned there. 33,000 people died in the camp from malnutrition or disease, and approximately 90,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz and other extermination camps from Theresienstadt. But no Jews deported from Denmark were sent to any extermination camps. Out of the more than 140,000 prisoners, only 17,247 people survived Theresienstadt by the end of the war, and only fewer than 150 children survived. Yet even today, many still wrongly believe that life in the camp was good because the Nazis used the camp for a propaganda film and a Red Cross visit showing shops full of merchandise to buy, children happily playing, people eating a variety of fresh food, and artwork that was all created under strict supervision and all produced to obscure the grim realities of the camp. The Nazis allowed only 2 names for girls born in the camp, Rachel or Sarah. My sister, Rachel, was born in the camp on January 1st, 1944. These drawings of my sister were created by a young woman in the camp 1 month before it was liberated. I'll talk more about the artist later on. My parents and sister were among those fortunate to be rescued by the Swedish Red Cross in April 1945. The war was not yet over, but Danish and Swedish leaders negotiated with the Nazis to release all the prisoners who had been deported from Denmark. And on May the 5th, 1945, Denmark was finally liberated when my parents, sister, and all the others who had been deported from Denmark returned there to begin rebuilding their lives. I was born in Denmark in the town of Kalundborg in 1946, and our family emigrated to the United States in December 1947. During my youth, my parents rarely spoke of their lives during the Holocaust years. When they did, it was primarily about the wonderful Danes. And then in 1978, I took a college course about the Holocaust. I was the only student in the class who had a family that had been in a concentration camp. And at the request of my professor, I asked my parents to share their memories of their capture and life in the camp, something they had never done before. My father shared vivid memories of daily life in the camp in his letter to me 35 years after the experience. He wrote this letter on November the 6th, 1978. We were arrested in Denmark in 1943 during Rosh Hashanah. I think it was October 3rd or the 4th. For 3 days and nights, we traveled in cattle wagons through Europe and ended up in Theresienstadt, where we stayed until April 1945. In the beginning, your mother stayed with the women, and I stayed with the men. After about a year, we were moved and had a room to ourselves. We had a lot of artists and writers and musicians among the prisoners. It might have been that some of the more prominent people, like the well-known rabbis or other leaders, were given single rooms instead of living in horse barns together with 300 to 400 other prisoners. I started out with a job in highway construction. We were building roads as experiments for the Germans, using different grades of elevation, drainage, and so on. Since there was no extra food involved, I applied to the Zionist organization that ran the inside of the camp and of which I was a member, asking for a different job because Mommy was pregnant and she needed the extra food. I was asked if I knew anything about cooking, and I said yes. And so I was transferred to the kitchen as a helper. From then on, we had more to eat, not only for us, but we helped others who were in our group that came with us from Denmark. Your mother had a job as a ghetto wache, which meant that she was like an officer on foot patrol, where she stood on a certain corner and watched each day for a certain amount of hours. After Rachel was born, he did not have to do this work anymore. Rachel was born in the hospital in the camp. The doctors who assisted Mom were doctors from Czechoslovakia, and they were interned also. Mom took care of Rachel, and when it was necessary, other mothers pitched in to help with the care. There was a band which played almost every day to, quote, cheer up, end quote, the prisoners in a little park in the center of the camp. There was nothing that you can imagine that you could not get at the camp if you had the right exchange. From musical instruments to false teeth, wristwatches, cigarettes, cigars, and all sorts of other articles. I do not remember the name of the commandant who changed quite frequently. We saw some of the higher-ups once in a while. They had their quarters outside of the camp. We had a Jewish council, which was the Jewish authority of the camp, but only if the Germans agreed to what was said. Nothing could be done officially without German consent. And what the commandants promised and what they did were often two different things. For example, officially families were not to be separated, so they sent the men or the women to the gas chambers in one transport, and then to reunite the family, they sent the rest of the members in the next transport. I do not remember how many tens of thousands were sent away in these transports from Terezin. We knew where they went because of the messages that were written on the walls of the railway wagons, and we knew where to look for them. It did not matter who was sent away as long as the German quota was filled. We had a Red Cross commission coming from Switzerland for an inspection one day. For this one day only, all the stores in the camp were open and had articles for sale in them. This was just for show, so the commission could see that the Germans were treating the prisoners all right. They started building gas chambers at Terezin, but these were never completed. We knew of Eichmann and Moser and other sadists. And we had one German officer who drove a motorcycle with the motor turned off, so you could not hear him coming. If anybody was in his way, he simply drove over that person. As far as news, we had a very reliable sort of information. Someone had a radio on the outside of the camp, and they supplied us with every important information you can think of, so that we would know what was happening the very same day. These reports were only given in a very special room where we could be sure that we knew everyone who was present, so that nobody could denounce us to the Nazis. The name of the town was Theresienstadt, and it was named after Russian Empress Maria Theresa. The town was originally a military post with 25 to 30-foot walls around it, made out of rocks, dirt, and bricks. The whole town was converted into a concentration camp, and the Germans lived on the outside. We never knew when they wanted an inspection. Mostly a few generals or high military persons would come to inspect what the inmates did and what they produced. We made what was called glimmer. These were aluminum strips of different lengths, which were made by the thousands and thrown out of airplanes to confuse the radar, making it impossible for Allied troops to listen to German reports when they broadcast their orders. These glimmer shifts worked around the clock, and every shift had quite a few people working, most of them women. We had to supply these workers with food, sometimes during the night, so that when an inspection was being made, they could point out to the officials that the prisoners were given extra rations for good work, which of course was just for that particular night. The rest of the time, they all worked with no food. We also built barracks for the German troops. After they were assembled, they would be inspected by the officers who sometimes wanted changes. Then we would dismantle them, and they were shipped away by railroad. These barracks came back time and again so that we could put them together blindfolded. Still, we had to do it because some officers had not seen them and they would come to examine them. This was a lot of work for nothing, no value whatsoever. Also, we were building roads about a mile long. But if the general did not like what we did, we had to rip the street apart and move the whole thing either to the left or the right, 3 feet. For the Red Cross visit, those who were sick and invalids were moved to areas which were out of the way. For those who could not be moved, they stayed where they were in the hospital or in the invalid home. Marion, there were prisoners living everywhere, wherever there was any space left where a mattress could be put down. And whatever was taken away from you at your arrival in the camp, your clothes, shoes, coats, soap, anything of value, you could buy in the stores whenever there was a sale day using ghetto money, which was given out once a month. If you were lucky, you could even buy back your own clothes. For working, I received money every month, but it was put in a savings account. And when we left the camp, the savings books were taken away from both Mom and myself. We got no receipt either. We were liberated by the Swedish Red Cross and left the camp before the end of the war. In my mother's letter, she described their capture and transport to the camp. We were picked up at 5 o'clock in the morning in big buses. We had been warned the night before from the Hechelits that there was a possibility that the Nazis would find us out in the country where all of our group were working for lovely Danish farmers. I had packed a suitcase with diapers and things for our new baby a few days before, just in case something would happen to us. Well, I was in the 7th month. Seeing all of our friends already in the bus calmed me down somehow. But the ugly thing was that we had to pick up on 2 other farms, the 2 children of friends who had already been brought to the farmer families a night or 2 before the raid. Marion, it was terrible. The farmers did not want to give the kids to the Gestapo, but they would have been shot. There was, of course, no choice. All of us had plenty of bread, butter, salami, and cheese supplied to us during the raid from farm to farm from the farmers. We even had some leftovers and were able to give a little to some roommates later in the camp. The condition in the cattle wagons is very hard to describe, Marion. It was so terrible. After we got shuffled in, the doors were locked. There were no toilet facilities. Much later, on a stop somewhere, we got some big pails with covers to do whatever had to be done. I don't have to spell out the feelings of all of us. Water to drink came much later. Some of our boys took off their boots at some of the stops, and they were allowed to put the water in their boots. I don't remember what we used for toilet paper. The pails were emptied once or twice a day when the train stopped. After we got to the camp, we got some food and were allowed to write one postcard to a family member. I do not remember if the card was ever received in Berlin. Later, we wrote to Mother, who by then was in Switzerland, and much later she told us that when she got the card from Theresienstadt, she fainted. Well, the day we arrived, we were naked, examined for our jewels and other things. My wedding band I hid in my rectum. Other Danish people lost thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. We were 460 people in the transport. The rest of the Jewish Danish people found out in time and were able to flee with the help of fishermen, priests, and ministers, all going to Sweden by night. People with no money were taken also, no questions asked, from the beautiful Danes. My other ring and jewelry, our radio and papers, we gave already to our neighbor before the raid. At the camp, I was asked if I wanted to have an abortion, which I refused. My friends were always helpful to me and tried to make me a little comfortable. We all learned what it meant to be hungry, but somehow people survived. We lost about 40 of our transport to sickness, hunger, and a few others died of old age. We lived in fear every day, but the Danish transport somehow was protected. Our rabbi from Copenhagen was also with the group. We Zionists were only about 150 people, but we were treated like all of the Danish Jews. The Zionists got the better jobs later, and so a lot of people could be helped not to be so very hungry. Marion, our life and feelings are impossible to bring out in talking or in writing. I can only tell everybody, it is amazing what people can go through and survive. The rations we got every 2 days were a loaf of bread, a little bag of sugar, and some spread. Rachel had bad whooping cough and got transfusions from Daddy. Otherwise, she would not be alive today. I know our camp was one of the better ones, but hunger, lice, fear, and death was the same daily worry. I remember my mother's gratitude when she recalled that when they returned to Denmark, 18 months after their capture, they found all of their belongings had been safely kept by the farmers they were working for. Not even a spoon was missing, she told me. Several years after my parents died in the 1980s, I read that the archives in the Danish Resistance Museum included an honor roll of Danish citizens who helped Jews during the Nazi occupation. This inspired me to begin a research effort to identify the farmers who stored and protected my parents' belongings so that I could request that the museum add their names to the other honorees. But my repeated attempts to identify the farmers were unsuccessful, and I didn't know until years later that only Danes active in the resistance movement were honored at the museum. The first unexpected event that would bring me to the house where my parents were captured began when my search was rekindled in August 2007, after my dear friend Renee told a story about my family's years in Denmark to her cousin Susan. Susan immediately thought of her friend Gerda, who lived in Denmark, and introduced us via email. Gerda is a retired professor and historian. Her interest was piqued, and she generously offered to resume the search I had started years before. My goal now was to let the farmers or their descendants know that their kindnesses were still remembered and deeply appreciated. Unbelievably, Gerda's research over the next 7 months provided not only the names of the farmers I had sought, but also a wealth of information my sister and I never knew about our parents' lives in Denmark. Gerda's credentials enabled her to view and copy my parents' file in the Danish National Archives, and she sent me the file, 43 pages. The file was originally maintained by the Danish police, who were responsible for regularly monitoring the living and working arrangements for all Hefelet's members living in Denmark. Because the pages were written in Danish, I needed them translated. Until now, the theme of 6 degrees of separation was only an abstraction to me, but it was about to get much more personal. Susan's brother Richard was married to Jette, a Danish woman, whose daughter Sina, from her previous marriage, spoke both Danish and English. She lived in New York, and I contacted her, and she translated all the pages in my parents' file. Sadly, in February of 2010, Susan passed away. At her home following the funeral, I met Fred, a longtime friend of Susan and Richard. One of the things we talked about was the information I received after Susan had connected me to Gerda. Fred told me he knew a woman who worked with an organization that he thought would be very interested in my family story. And a few days later, I was speaking with Liv, who works with Thanks to Scandinavia. This organization honors the rescue efforts of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden during World War II by funding scholarships to students from these countries, giving them an opportunity to study in the United States or in Israel. Liv encouraged me to write my family story and post it on the organization's website in the personal stories section, which I did. The information about my parents' life in Denmark was further enhanced by Jorgen Hastrup's book, Passage to Palestine, Young Jews in Denmark, 1932 to 1945. This informative book enabled me to view my family's story within a larger historical context, including the goals and achievements of Hefeletz and the events leading to my parents' capture. It also gave me a clearer understanding of and a deeper appreciation for the resistance, courage, and morality of the Danish people and the government of King Christian X. Despite some negative revelations about the king's cooperation with the Nazis, I remain convinced that without the continued support of the king, the Danish government, and its citizens during my parents' internment, it is likely my family would have been annihilated and I would never have been born. The archived information I received from Gerda identified Axel and Vibeke Pedersen as the owners of Volbergard, the Assens farm where my parents worked in 1943 until they were taken prisoner. Amazingly, when Renee's husband Marty and I searched the internet, we located not only the Volbergard farm, but also its email address. I emailed about my interest in the Pedersens and received a response from the farm's current owner, who told me that the Pedersens had died and provided the email address of their daughter Brita, who still lived nearby. Brita and I then exchanged emails until we met in May of 2010, when Renee and I and our husbands were guests at her bed and breakfast as we retraced some of my parents' history in Denmark. While there, Rita reviewed old photographs that I had brought with me, including ones taken at her family farm. Suddenly, with her eyes wide, she turned to me and said, "That was your family." She went on to say that she remembered her mother telling her not to play with any of the things in the big yellow trunk upstairs. Her mother said everything in there belongs to the farm helpers who had to go away, and we are holding their belongings until they come back. For me, the most meaningful belongings that the farm has safely kept are those that represent tangible, personal connections to my family's history that my parents and my grandparents treasured and that I hold dear, and that my daughters and granddaughters now have them to hold and treasure as well. Each item, a piece of family identity with its own anecdotes that have been repeated through the generations. This delicate handkerchief that was made in my great-grandfather's lace factory in Berlin and carried by generations of women in our family on their wedding day as there's something old. And the family photos dating back to my great-grandparents. And birth certificates and marriage licenses of my parents, grandparents, and even my great-grandparents. 2 spoons from my father's infancy with his initials on the back that both my daughters and granddaughters used when they were young. And silverware that belonged to my paternal grandparents that I still use today. Rita drove us to the Volbergard farm where the owners were expecting us. We got the royal tour, including the old barn, the only building on the property that had not been renovated. And so I was able to walk on the same cobblestone floor that my dad walked on so many years before. Later, after studying the photo of my mother in front of that thatched roof house, Rita happily announced, "I know this house. I will take you there." As I stood in front of the house where my parents were taken prisoner, my husband photographed the moment, and I tearfully thought about my parents leaving this house and boarding the Gestapo bus, waiting for them on the narrow, quiet street I was facing. Using other information from the Danish archive file and additional online research, I happily found that the house where my family lived when I was born was still there. And so we included a visit to that house in our itinerary. The house is located on the beautiful grounds of the Lerchenburg estate in Kalundborg, where my father worked as a laborer farmer after their return to Denmark. The estate is not open to the general public, but because of my parents' history there, we all were welcomed to stay the night. Shortly after our return from Denmark, I received a letter from Athens. It was from a friend of Brita's. Dear Marion Novack, I understand that you have been to Denmark to visit your parents' home in Volbro, where they lived during World War II. My husband, Jorga Pedersen, lived at a farm nearby and told me about your parents. He told me that he often visited your family and that he helped them pack their belongings until midnight. Unfortunately, the Gestapo came at 5 o'clock in the morning and arrested them. My father-in-law was the one who kept their securities and jewelries until they returned after the war. Our whole village had been in great sorrow after the Germans had taken your parents to Theresienstadt. And so great was our joy when it became known that your parents had survived and they had come back to the village after the war. My husband's sister married a Jewish man who also lived in the village during the war. He was able to escape to Sweden and returned when the war was over. Just yesterday, my sister-in-law visited me. She is 95 years old, but still remembers your parents with whom she corresponded after the war. And she remembered that they wrote that they had another daughter. That must have been you being born. I am 87, but still remember everything. When our country was finally liberated, there was great happiness to be able to think and talk freely again. I hope your family and you had and have a good life in America. With kindest regards, Edith Pedersen. And then yet another extraordinary surprise. My posted family story on the Thanks to Scandinavia website generated an email to the organization from Sylvia, a PhD student in France, who was writing her dissertation about the deportation of Jews from Denmark to Theresienstadt. She asked to contact me directly. Our correspondence provided helpful information for both of us. Her dissertation was published, including a quote from my mother's letter. Excuse me. We learned what it meant to be hungry. These are just a few of the highlights her research provided to me. My mother's letter indicated that 460 people were deported from Denmark to Theresienstadt. Sylvia provided clarification. There were actually 4 transports. My parents were on the first, which deported 83 Jews. Sylvia wrote, quote, "Your sister was the first baby born amongst the Danes in the camp. 4 others were born later, but 2 of them died when only a few weeks old. There is almost nothing written about these babies or their mothers and how horrible it must have been for these women to give birth in a concentration camp and then to care for their newborns in a densely overcrowded ghetto with sanitary problems, food shortages, and people dying all around them." End quote. Sylvia also had access to a list prepared by the Danish Administration Office that indicated my parents' addresses within the camp and receipts for 1 food parcel each from the Danish Red Cross, dated October 1944. Regarding the Red Cross visit that my father mentioned in his letter, Sylvia added that the Danish representatives brought a list with greetings from Denmark. Not everyone received one, but the one my parents received was signed by Jorge, the late husband of Edith, whose letter I read to you a few moments ago. And yet there was still one unsolved mystery. We did not know the name of the young woman who drew the pictures of my sister in the camp. She was signed only with her initials, RMG. Sylvia solved the mystery. Through her research, she identified the artist as Rosemarie Gompertz. Using the internet, I discovered she was a Dutch Jewess who joined the resistance in 1942 and was deported to Theresienstadt in September 1944. After her liberation, she returned to the Netherlands and ultimately pursued a career as a painter. This is a self-portrait. I wrote to her about the drawings she did of my sister and how much our family treasured them. Unfortunately, I learned by return letter that she had Alzheimer's. She died in 2014 at the age of 95. When I began my initial research, I had no idea that years later I would take an extraordinary journey into my parents' past and create a memorable story of my own. A story of discovery and of the people who helped to bridge my parents' past to my present. This last slide is of me standing in front of the same house where my parents were taken prisoner. Now, for those of you who would like to learn more about Theresienstadt, there is a virtual exhibit presented by the Leo Baeck Institute entitled Last Stop Before the Last Stop, Theresienstadt, 1942 to 1945. In addition, I encourage all of you who have not already seen it to visit the excellent exhibit at the Museum of Jewish Heritage called Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark. Thank you all for your attention and your interest. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Marion, for that incredible presentation. I know we have some questions from the audience that were submitted while you were speaking. But just a reminder to our audience, if anyone is inspired to submit a question during this Q&A, please feel free to do so, and we'll get to as many as we can. So to start off, a couple different people actually have asked about what inspired you to start telling your parents' story, if it was a particular moment, if it started with the Holocaust course you took, or if it was, something more gradual that you came to.
It was actually, the first time I did a presentation was to my older granddaughter's fourth grade class.
Mm.
They were studying the Holocaust, and I did a presentation to them. After that, several people asked me if they could listen to the presentation. And so the
Mhm.
presentation evolved over a period of time.
Thank you. We have another sort of related question. Someone is asking in particular about your parents coming and sharing their stories at your course in college on the Holocaust. And they're wondering if that experience inspired you all to have more conversations about your desire to share their stories, or if that experience also inspired them to speak more about their experiences.
Neither my mother nor my father ever spoke about the concentration camp again.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have another question that is a little bit more specific about your family's experience. We have someone wondering if you know how difficult it was for your family to get visas to come to America when they immigrated.
It was actually not that difficult.
Mhm.
My grandmother was already, my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, was already in New York.
Mhm.
And one of her friends was a schoolmate from when she was in boarding school in Switzerland.
Mm.
And she was married, and that woman and her husband were the ones that signed the papers so that my parents could come to the United States with me and my
Wow.
sister.
Incredible. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We have another more specific question as well. One of our audience members is noting that they have personally never heard of a family being allowed to live together in a camp, as they remember you saying yours was, and they want to know if you think that that was done because of efforts by the Danish government to protect their citizens.
Believe that it was.
Thank you. We also have a couple questions about your experience and your family's experience going back to Denmark. We have a couple people asking how many times you've been there, and also someone wants to know, they can't remember if you shared if your children and your grandchildren went with you or if they've been by themselves as well.
In 2010, my husband Marshall and I went with our friends Renee and Marty, who was so helpful in connecting me to all of these people, one
Mhm.
after the other. That was the only visit that we made to Denmark.
Mhm.
But my older daughter Lorraine and her daughter, my granddaughter Chloe, actually went and stayed with Prita, the
Oh,
farmer's
incredible.
daughter, had her bed and breakfast, and
Oh.
also retraced my parents' steps.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. We have another question. A few people are asking if your parents considered going somewhere else aside from the US after they left Denmark, or if the US was really sort of their one and only goal in mind.
I think at that point, the United States became the goal.
Mhm.
One of the reasons why was that my maternal grandmother was living in New York, and
Mhm.
she was one of the last surviving members of the family.
Oh.
And so I think to reunite the family, my parents decided to go to the United States.
Mhm. Thank you. We have someone who is also asking about the incredible presentation that you shared with us
Thank you.
today. They are, they noted you had, incredible photographs and documents, and you also provided a lot of historical information in addition to your family's story. So a couple people are wondering about your process of putting together this presentation, sort of how you decided what to include in terms of photographs and artifacts, and also if you ended up having to do any historical research to supplement your family's story that you included in the presentation as well.
I did a tremendous amount of research
Yeah.
in order to come up with all of the historical information. I wanted to make sure that I was presenting accurate information.
Mhm.
I didn't go to just one source, I went to multiple sources. And I was very grateful that there was so much material that was available. It was just necessary to go and find it. I actually found the death certificate of my great uncle, who was in the
Wow.
same camp as my mother and father. And that death certificate is online, and the cause of death is suicide. He hung himself.
Powerful. Thank you for sharing. We have another specific question from a listener that I'll read. This listener mentions that her mother was sent to Theresienstadt to bring someone for medical treatment, and that when she left to return to where she worked in a factory as a slave laborer, someone handed her currency from the camp that this listener still has in her home. And she's wondering if this is something that you've heard of and if you might have any of it in your possession. And she's also wondering if you have any suggestions of what she might do with it, if there are places to donate it or loan it somewhere so it can be seen by more people.
I do not have any of the money.
Mhm.
I would expect that it was either ghetto money that my father talked about, where occasionally you could go in and buy something in one of the stores.
Mhm.
My father did mention that there was also money put into savings accounts, but
Mhm.
the books were taken away from them. The Center for Jewish History
Mhm.
actually has a file on my mother and father,
Mhm.
and the bank book, I use the term loosely,
Mhm.
was actually, there's a copy of it actually there. I do not have any of that money, and I would strongly urge her to donate that money to the
Mhm.
Museum of Jewish Heritage.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that information, and it's something I didn't know myself. So thank you for sharing. We have a couple more questions here. We have someone, and apologies if you mentioned this in your presentation, but they're wondering if you've been to the Resistance Museum in Denmark, and if so, what you felt when you visited and what were your thoughts on it?
We actually did not visit the Resistance Museum,
Mhm.
something that I'm sorry about, and if we ever go back to Denmark, that will be a priority.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Um, it looks like we are getting close to the end of the hour, and I think we've gotten most of the questions, but I think a nice place to wrap up is we have a couple people who've asked a few related questions. We have some people who are asking, what the reaction in general has been when you've shared this story, your family's story, both with, student audiences and adult audiences. Um, and if students have reacted differently than the adults in any sort of significant ways. And then lastly, a couple people have asked what you hope, if there was one thing that listeners would take away or learn from your family's story, what you hope that would be.
Um, I do get different reactions from adults and
Mhm.
students. I really enjoy doing the presentation for the students.
Mhm.
Their questions are just amazing. The one question I always remember was one little boy in the sixth grade who asked me how I felt after I read my father's letter and my mother's letter.
Mhm.
An amazing question from a sixth grader. Um, I'm sorry, what was the last part?
And the last part is a few people have asked if there's, one important thing that you would hope listeners take away from your family's story, what would it be? What lesson or takeaway would you want?
Stand up, speak out.
Yeah, well, I think that's, a beautiful takeaway, and I think a nice moment to end on as well. I think we got to everybody's questions, but apologies if any slipped through the cracks. I'd like to thank you, Marion, again so much for coming and sharing your story with us, your family's story, and for such an incredible presentation. I would also like to just take a moment and thank our audience for joining us this evening. Before we leave tonight, I just put a few more links in the chat that you all may find helpful. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope that you'll join us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. So thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great
Thank you,
night.
everybody.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Marion.
I appreciate your interest. Thank you so much.
Thank you all and have a great evening.